My next step before I start sewing my pattern pieces is to sew a sample piece just to make sure that my machine is working correctly and everything is set up for the type of fabric that I'm using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew a zigzag finish stitch around the entire square. We do this whenever we are sewing with materials that can unravel, so that way when we go to wash our project the first time, the seams of our fabric don't unravel so much that it ruins what we've made. So I'm going to go ahead and just set my machine to 3 if it's a FAF, different settings for different machines for the zigzag stitch. I'm going to line up the edge of my fabric so that it's inside of my presser foot, because I really want to get the zigzag stitch as close to the edge as possible to create that finishing stitch. So the purpose of this is to make sure mostly that our machine is sewing correctly, number 1, and number 2, that our tension is correct. So on this first row of stitching that I did, when I look on the back side, I can see that it got really, really loopy. Well, that's because my fabric is really thin, and it didn't make like a nice X. So I decided, without even finishing the rest of it, that I was going to go ahead and increase my tension a little bit. And so then you can see on the second side, I did get a nicer looking zigzag than I did the first side. So I'm going to just continue with that. All right, now that I have my zigzag stitch done, I'm ready to practice a seam. So the instructions say to fold the fabric in half with right sides together. My fabric didn't have a clear right and wrong side, so just like I did with my other pattern piece, I'm going to go ahead and just create an X. That will be the wrong side of my fabric. So when I go ahead and sew it together, I'm going to fold the other 2 ends together so I have right sides together. You can choose to trim your threads now or at the end. I prefer to trim my threads before I start sewing anything together, just that way they don't get caught up. So I'm going to fold my fabric in half, right sides together. I'm going to stick a couple of pins in it just so that I make sure that my fabric is staying nice and in place with my edges together. Then I'm going to sew a 5/8 inch stitch down on one side of the fabric. So I'm going to line up the edges of my fabric with the 5/8 inch mark on my sewing machine. Because I'm doing a straight stitch, I'm going to start really close to the edge, making sure that that edge of the fabric is lined up with the 5/8. I am always going to do a back stitch at the beginning and the end. This creates a type of knot in the end of your fabric, so that way your threads won't unravel. Before I start stitching, I'm going to just make sure that I have reset my machine back to a straight stitch. I'm going to sew forward a couple of stitches, and then I'm going to reverse or back stitch a couple of stitches. I'm going close to the back to the edge of the fabric. Then I'm going to just forward stitch, keeping the edge of my fabric lined up on the 5/8 inch mark. And I'm going to go all the way down to the edge of my fabric, really getting close to the end, using my hand wheel for that very last stitch if needed. Then I'm going to reverse stitch 3 to 5 stitches. Then to finish this stitch, I'm going to end that reverse stitch, and I'm going to sew back to the edge of the fabric, or even off of it is fine. You really want to make sure when you're doing your stitching, when you're sewing anything together, that you are getting your stitching as close to, if not off, the edge of the fabric, unless it says otherwise. All right, my next step is to practice seam ripping. So seam ripping is a really important tool to use in sewing, because if we sew something incorrectly, we want to just be able to take it, the last thing we sewed out, versus starting all over again. In a seam ripper, there's this little area right in between in the curve that has a little tiny blade on it. So that is the part that is going to cut. This is kind of a safety piece so that you don't cut through your fabric, and this is how you can poke through into the stitches. So what I'll do is I'll just poke through into a set of stitches, and then as I push it all the way through, it will cut that thread. And then I'll kind of just work my way through the stitching to take out half of the stitch I just made for my sample to practice your seam ripping abilities. And you can go from one side to the other, just pulling up and picking at and cutting those threads as you're going.